Roger Walcott Sperry was born on August 20th, 1913, in a small suburb of Hartford, Connecticut. Sperry's early education was in Elmwood, Connecticut. Later, he attended William Hall High School in Hartford. From there, he went on to attend Oberlin College, where he obtained a bachelor's in English and a master's in psychology. Sperry subsequently received a doctoral degree in zoology from the University of Chicago. Following his doctoral work, Sperry served as a National Research Council Fellow at Harvard University.
Mr. Sperry was a Oberlin undergraduate, graduating in 1935 with a degree in English, and he stayed on to take a master's degree in psychology. He is one of 3 Nobel laureates that have graduated from Oberlin College in the 20th century.
Sperry's professional career began as a research fellow in biology at Harvard. He also worked at Yerkes Laboratories of Primate Biology before taking a position as assistant professor in the Department of Anatomy at the University of Chicago. Later, while working as an associate professor in the psychology department at Chicago, Sperry served as the section chief of neurological diseases and blindness at the National Institutes of Health. Sperry's professional career came to fruition at the California Institute of Technology, where he served as Hickson Professor of Psychobiology for the duration of his working life.
Sperry and I would often engage in various conversations more about the philosophy of science, I guess, than about science at that point, because he had gotten very interested in how to integrate the idea of a mind that emerged from the activities of brain with the idea of self-determination.
I think the most important thing about psychology is his contributions to psychology involve the unusual way that he was able to integrate philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology in much the same way that William James had proposed psychology should be well over 100 years ago. So in many ways, his most significant accomplishment to me is that he went back to the beginning and provided data about the speculations that were posed by the fathers of psychology.
Sperry was, I thought, the outstanding neuroscientist of the time. And he not only thought up experiments, but when other people thought up experiments, he would point out where the experiments were faulty, or, you know, he was the best scientific critic he could have.
Sperry's research on nerve regeneration using muscle and nerve transplantation in rats, salamanders, and monkeys, and optic nerve regeneration in frogs, salamanders, and fish was among his many accomplishments.
The work with nerve regeneration assumes that there is a plasticity to the nervous system, or questions whether there is a plasticity to the nervous system. The idea is that the nerves inside the nervous system were interchangeable, motor, sensory, and so forth. And in reality, in a series of experiments involving a number of species and both motor and sensory fibers, in very simple experiments, he proved beyond reasonable certainty that there was very little malleability in the peripheral nervous system. That is subsequently what resulted in his questioning, was this lack of plasticity or malleability generalizable to the central nervous system, because it was clearly evident that it wasn't present in a variety of species ranging from amphibians, fish, to mammalians. So the question became, is this replicable inside the central nervous system, and namely the brain? And that's where he became interested in the largest fiber that cuts across both sides of the brain, or connects both sides of the brain, I should say, and that's a corpus callosum. So his his quest at that point was to attempt to determine whether the nervous system was malleable inside the brain. And by cutting the corpus callosum, he was able to decipher whether indeed that was the case. Starting out with cats, subsequently continuing on with monkeys, and finally with a series of experiments in humans, he came to the conclusion that indeed the nervous system was not very malleable inside as well as outside the CNS.
Sperry took the nerves from the hind legs of rats and switched them, putting the nerves from the left leg into the right leg and the nerves from the right leg into the left leg. Through these experiments, Sperry proved that when nerve connections were rearranged, inappropriate responses resulted that could not be unlearned. Basically, the stimulation of the right foot caused the rat to move his left foot, and no training or experience could be done to change the response. The research using frogs showed similar results. Sperry showed that individual nerve fibers behave independently from each other. For example, in an animal whose optic nerves have been severed and its eye rotated in its socket, there is no reorganization of the neural circuits. This causes the animal to view the world upside down and backwards without the possibility of relearning or through experience changing the behavior. The animal will inevitably strike to the left when it sees a fly on its right, and to the right if the fly is on the left. The conclusion of these studies reveal that the circuitry of the brain is fixed during early development.
In highlighting these laterally specialized functions of the two hemispheres and bringing that to the attention of the public, although the Nobel Prize said that, the split brain work discovered that, and I feel free to say, no, it didn't discover it, because a lot of that was my work. And it wasn't a discovery. It was a verification of what other people had done earlier in that, but it had its impact by highlighting these differences, opening new ways to examine them, and bringing it to the attention of the whole field of psychology.
In 1981, Dr. Sperry received the Nobel Prize for his research on split brain activity. The research showed that if the two hemispheres were separated by severing the corpus callosum, there would no longer be a transfer of information. Furthermore, the research proved that each hemisphere was capable of functioning on its own. Sperry began his testing on cats and monkeys. Later, he also studied humans who had been suffering with epilepsy.
It's important to try and put the chronology of Sperry's research in proper order. First, he did a lot of the corpus callosum studies with cats in Chicago. He subsequently proceeded to continue these studies at Caltech with monkeys, and subsequently with humans. As you can imagine, it's almost impossible to obtain volunteers to have their corpus callosum cut. And there was indeed Joe Bogan, if I believe at that point a resident, who had suggested to Sperry that the possibility existed of having the corpus callosum severed in humans. And specifically, there was a patient who had intractable epilepsy, and the idea of cutting the corpus callosum could solve two problems: addressing the questions that Sperry had proposed, as well as reducing the number and severity of the seizures that this individual was experiencing. Subsequently, Bogan and another neurosurgeon, who I believe could be considered Bogan's mentor, Philip Bogle, proceeded in doing the series of split brains, which of course is fascinating in themselves, in that the split brains are full split brains. This is something that's not done anymore.
See, people who had tried that operation for epilepsy before, first of all, they really didn't do the operation completely, most of them. But when they tested the patients, there was some guy named Acolytus tested the patients. He didn't know how to test them. But 20 years later now, we know how to test them because of all the cats and the monkeys.
Through his work with these patients, Sperry was able to demonstrate the presence of a conscious mind in each hemisphere. The left hemisphere controls speech and is dominant in writing and mathematical calculations. The right hemisphere is incapable of verbal communication, but excels in spatial comprehension and nonverbal concept formation.
I told them to reach behind the curtain and pick out an object that went with the verb. So if I would give a verb like roll, they would pick out a wheel or a ball. Or if I said sit, I had toy chairs as one of the objects. And in that way, they could demonstrate comprehension of verbs as well as nouns with the right hemisphere when you gave them the same test.
Through his research, Sperry devised methods of communicating with the right hemisphere which had previously been thought of as being unconscious. Sperry found that, though separated, both hemispheres were still capable of learning, but they could not share the knowledge. For example, a patient with a severed corpus callosum was asked to replicate a drawing of a cross and a box that were located in the middle of a page. Even though the patient was right-handed, he was not capable of reproducing the drawings with his right hand, which is controlled by the left hemisphere. The patient was, however, able to replicate the drawing with his left hand fairly well, since it is controlled by the right hemisphere.
One of the most interesting and poorly misunderstood ones is the idea of the regeneration of the nerve cell. Until very recently, it was believed that the nerve cell did not regenerate, so if there was any recovery of function, it had to do with literally a new set of pathways. There's recent evidence to suggest that there is neurogenesis, and the question is, does it occur, and how does it occur? The neural growth factor, among other things, and chemoaffinity theories are so integrated in the field of neuroscience. It's now almost common sense ideas. Within psychology, the integration of philosophy and neuroscience into neuropsychology has now become commonplace. And finally, maybe more importantly, is the idea of careful analysis of brain function through very simple psychological techniques. As a matter of fact, a lot of the tests that Sperry used for his split brain work came out of traditional psychological test catalogs, not applicable to these kinds of things, but subsequently popularized as a function of such.
The whole history of his research, which I knew very well because I had, read this, showed a man who kept his focus on the questions that he thought were interesting and important, and he would come into my office, and everybody's office, all his students, and say constantly things like, why are you doing what you're doing? What is the importance of what you're doing? So he made me, think to myself, why am I doing this? What is the importance? This helped one avoid doing trivial things, because he was really, he toughly challenged you on that to make you state clearly what question are you addressing, why is that question important, what would be the implications. So that was one thing. Another thing that I guess I must have gotten from him, wasn't particularly conscious, I guess, but was this integrity of keeping the focus on nature and not one's ideas about nature. That is, to never fall in love with your own ideas so much that they superseded your love of nature.
Sperry's work had a tremendous impact across disciplines.
The notable achievements of Sperry are really complex in many ways and simple in others. Complex, and they span a series of fields. For example, He is an eminent neuroscientist, or was an eminent neuroscientist. He received the highest award in psychology, the Lifetime Achievement Award, presented to him by APA. In addition to that, he's also well regarded in philosophical circles. So probably his greatest achievement is that he reached the top of the field in 3 entirely different areas, and 3 areas that are often not highly integrated: neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy. And in many ways, his greatest accomplishment, I think, is returning to the foundation of William James, who in his book entitled Psychology, addressed the questions, the fundamental questions of psychology with a very strong neuropsychological emphasis. But in many ways, what he did is he brought together the philosophical, the neuroscientific, and the psychological together in a cohesive and very robust, yet simple and elegant fashion.
Sperry's research provided a foundation for much additional study and is highly referenced today.
The Sperry papers came to the college archives as a consequence of a visit made by Mr. Sperry in the mid-1980s on the occasion of the dedication of the Roger W. Sperry Neuroscience Building. And at the same time, Mr. Sperry had received an honorary degree from Oberlin College. On the occasion of these 2 events, he remarked that he intended to place his professional papers with Oberlin College.
The strength of Sperry's work is apparent and remains highly influential. Researchers continue to reference his work and expand on his ideas.
This was one way that Sperry was. He was scientifically very honest, to the point that many scientists, they don't mean to be dishonest, but they fall so in love with their ideas that they're more in love with their own notions of reality than of reality itself. So nature sort of becomes secondary to their notions of how nature ought to be. But Sperry was not that way at all. He really had a very deep-seated curiosity about the way nature really was, what was reality. So he could have a idea about it, or a notion about it, or belief about it, but he was ready to abandon that instantly if nature came back and said, "You're wrong." The instant that happened, he would say, "Okay," and that was very refreshing.
His work led to the publication of over 300 articles. Meanwhile, he led an apparently normal life. Sperry had a wife and 2 children and reportedly went home for lunch each day. Lunch was followed by a nap, then back to work.
Sperry was very devoted to his wife of many years, Norma Dupree Sperry, who in her own right was an accomplished scientist, but was a behind-the-scenes individual devoted to him and their 2 children. She was very focused on assisting him, whether it was in scheduling trips, social functions, or actually editing his work. He was, in addition to an individual interested in his family, he was very much of a fossil hunter, put together a most unusual collection of fossils, and was also an avid fisherman. As a matter of fact, when the Nobel Prize for medicine and physiology was awarded in 1981, he was fishing in Baja Peninsula of Mexico. He was not contacted for several days because of his lack of communication. So in many ways, Sperry was much more than that. He also enjoyed art, sculpting, painting, and square dancing, and he was never one to turn away from a good party. So he was a very complex individual, very shy, very driven, very passionate, and maybe difficult for some to agree, compassionate. Compassionate not just towards others, but to the world's problems as well.